Allora ragazzi, come promesso, direi che è arrivato il momento. E questa è una cosa che volevo vedere da molto tempo. Ce l'avevo proprio in canna da molto, no? Ve ne avevo anche parlato in passato e non c'è stata finora occasione, e adesso però sì. Voglio vedere insieme a voi l'intervista a Moon Studios fatta sul canale di Dario Moccia, ma da Fossetti e Mottura. Ok? Quindi adesso mutiamo la musica, ecco l'audio, volume, a posto. Ok. Omnisphere come VST, cosa ne pensi? Una volta era una figata colossale, ma poi diciamo che ci sono state tante altre alternative. Ok, eccoci qua ragazzi, siete pronti? Dura una mezz'oretta all'incirca. Noi ce la vediamo intera e vediamo che cosa dà.
Ringraziamo NordVPN. NordVPN serve a rubare le serie, no scherzo, serve a guardare cose che non potete vedere sugli altri siti.
Quando si fa una reaction è buono vedere l'intero video, compresi gli sponsor.
NordVPN
ovviamente
bisogna andare un po' a recuperare tutte le cose che vi mancano. Grazie a NordVPN sugli altri siti lo potete fare.
Caricatelo, è gratuito.
Non credo sia, no, però a modo.
Però noi ci teniamo a queste cose.
Se volete proteggere i vostri dati quando siete vi connettete a una connessione di Starbucks a Milano, no?
Che fai?
Avete paura che ci sia?
sai che giocare su Game Pass c'è un puttanaio di roba.
No, VPN è quello per
non sai cosa giocare, comincia ad andare a caso,
insomma,
letteralmente.
usufruire dei servizi di NordVPN.
Tanto sono lì.
Mille perché è tutto a posto,
Ecco sì, dovrebbero parlare, che io sappia, sì, infatti me l'avevano detto, di No Rest for the Wicked, che è il prossimo gioco di Moon Studios. Cosa pensi di Arthur Morgan? Red Dead Redemption 2 è diventato uno dei miei giochi preferiti degli ultimi anni.
I know it's unconventional to, have an interview a few days after the reveal.
So I'll start with the first question. We spoke to many people and pretty much everyone thought that No Rest for the Wicked was the highlight of the event in a crowded show with many announcements. So can you please explain how that magnificent trailer came to be? Maybe also something about the song that's so powerful tells a lot about the atmosphere and the vibe of the obscure and yet
sì, è la prima volta che la vedo.
By corruption.
Well, the trailer is a long story. We started first thinking about in summer of this year that we would probably be at the TGAs, right? And then we did the first concepts of what we would want to show there. There were actually a lot of versions. But then it became pretty clear from our publisher that, like it had to be structured a certain way, right? And that people really absolutely
Zio Luca, se passi al PC ci vorrà un po' di tempo abituarsi, se hai sempre giocato su console. Il mio personale consiglio è appassionati proprio all'ambiente PC. Questo ti consentirà di risparmiarti tante rotture di palle.
We will show you more. But then we changed it, and it was a pretty wild ride, right? We did over 950 revisions of the trailer, which is pretty crazy, which is the typical Moon Studios thing, right? There's lots and lots of versions. Matteo can probably tell you all about it, right?
Luca, grazie mille della sub.
We have this whole automation thing, right? Where if somebody makes a change, you can immediately click a button
per 6 mesi
exactly
grazie mille.
Looks like. And then regarding the song, we actually decided that we'd partner up with Jason Graves for this project. Jason is a prolific composer, and he is actually good friends with a couple of artists that we always wanted to work with, like Maluka, and I don't think I can mention the other name yet, but it's also really cool. We obviously knew Maluka for some time, right? Because I think everyone saw her YouTube video of singing The Dragonborn Comes and so on, the Skyrim song. And she has a beautiful voice. And we had these tavern songs that we wrote for No Rest for the Wicked that one of our writers wrote. And there's a lot more where that came from, by the way. And we picked that. And Jason then, changed it from this very cheery atmosphere to something a little bit more somber that would fit the trailer. And we liked it a lot. But again, also this went through many iterations before it was what it finally became.
La mia domanda è, dopo il successo dei Due Ori, quant'è l'impiego delle forze su questo nuovo titolo? Perché di solito quando si fa un gioco va bene, si investe ancora di più sul secondo, ma poi quando una serie di titoli va così bene, l'impiego di forza è sicuramente maggiore, però volevo capire in che scala e soprattutto come si dipartisce un investimento di questo tipo.
Also, maybe
Paradiso Crisis 4?
You said
San
before back in
Tommaso.
the day that
Finché non vedo non
Ori
credo.
was supposed to be your Super Mario and this next project was meant to be your Zelda, so maybe you can
Allora, qui mi voglio fermare un attimo, ragazzi, perché voglio darvi il giusto contesto. Questa è una cosa molto importante in realtà, perché Moon Studios, quello che ha detto, è un tantinello, come dire, giusto per tenere basse le aspettative, no? Ha detto, se Ori è stato il nostro Mario, No Rest for the Wicked, quindi il prossimo gioco, sarà il nostro Zelda. E tu dici, ah, ok, beh, guarda, prima avevo delle aspettative alte, adesso sicuro non si sono abbassate. Ok, bene, nel senso ambizioso, vagamente, però ok, sono contento dell'ambizione. Speriamo. Speriamo.
elaborate a bit more on this too, since the game has been unveiled.
I always saw Ori as our Mario because it's a Metroidvania, but at the same time it's hard. Yeah, it's hard. It's really a platformer. So I saw it as like we did something like Mario, and so even back in end of 2016, I started making.
Mamma mia, Ori, quanto lo adoro.
Will of the Wisps even was in production, and so I started making a prototype. And I thought, man, wouldn't it be cool if, as Moon Studios, our next project would be Zelda, right? So we would follow that same trajectory that Nintendo did back then. And so I made a prototype that was just this top-down action adventure, and it very quickly became clear we could probably turn this into a full-blown action RPG. But we decided as a studio that it would be safer for us for now to actually make a sequel. Also, we got thousands of mails from people that absolutely wanted a sequel to Ori. So we were like, okay, let's do it. That gives us some time to actually improve our tools, our processes, hire more people, grow the studio. And so that's what we did. We shipped Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Halfway through Ori and the Will of the Wisps, we actually already started on No Rest for the Wicked. And so, yeah, we had to grow the team quite quickly. No Rest for the Wicked is basically our first really big AAA game, right? Where we have we're not like thousands of people yet. I think right now we are around 85 people, but it is a much higher budget production than any of the Ori games were.
Sono 85 persone e fanno un gioco AAA. Questa cosa era praticamente impensabile un tempo, Nel senso, avere un budget simile, far lavorare così poche persone su un gioco, c'è un cambiamento nell'industria che c'è stato negli ultimi anni, che è piuttosto importante, e delle realtà più, chiamiamole piccole, Moon Studios non è esattamente piccolissimo come studio, però non è neanche particolarmente grande, non sono neanche 100 le persone che ci lavorano dentro, e se una realtà come questa è in grado di produrre un gioco pienamente AAA, è in realtà una bella cosa, molto bella. Peccato non si è già, ho provato più volte anche con Hollow Knight, Celeste, ma niente. Ci sta, il tuo genere, ci sta assolutamente, non c'è niente di male. Grazie al videogioco di successo.
Comunque
se si vuole anche da soli.
A Mario Z, è incredibile questi due titoli come riescono ancora a influenzare
Undertale,
così tanti
per esempio.
nuovi studi.
Tra l'altro faccio notare che lui ha detto non siamo ancora da centinaio, cioè yet.
Sì, perché
probabilmente l'ambizione è quella di
si
arrivare
pensa
da quelle
sempre in
partite.
grande,
certo. No, poi nel corso dello sviluppo di un titolo dovete sapere, se non conoscete un po' i meccanismi, i team si allargano e si restringono nelle varie fasi, quindi ci sta che a metà dello sviluppo magari arrivino anche un pochino dei contributi da esterni che però allargano un pochino il numero di persone che lavorano su un singolo gioco.
A me impressiona che solo 50 persone abbiano lavorato al secondo Ori. È impressionante.
Tipo
Quando
brave come questo qui.
eravamo 55.
55 secondo me, assurdo.
I'm a huge Sergio Leone fan, and so I watch a lot of his interviews and so on. Obviously, he always speaks Italian, so this sounds like that, which is beautiful language.
So, considering the stunning attention to detail, for sure
tipo
it
io
looks
quando
and
sento
hopefully
parlare
plays,
giapponese.
like something completely on its own. But if you had to
Old man.
compare No Rest for the Wicked to other games, which one would you name? Is it a bit of a mixture of Diablo and Dark Souls? Maybe the first one for the camera and the second for the strategic attention to combat?
What you're doing there is quite useful, right? So that people actually they can understand kind of like where we are heading, right? So I would say you take the combat, what you have in like Souls games or Monster Hunter, you bring in full multiplayer, and then we also have all these social elements, right? So it's basically mixed Diablo, Dark Souls,
Gianluca,
Zelda,
grazie mille delle sub in regalo.
Like
grazie di cuore.
Valley. That's basically where we're heading.
No, io volevo chiedere l'apporto creativo, cioè quindi anche quello che fa Matteone, cioè il fatto di cambiare da un gioco 2D a un gioco di questo tipo, cosa comporta a livello creativo, cioè i disegni, gli sfondi, come fanno i creativi ad
sto morendo dentro, purtroppo in realtà
con
un po' lo
il loro
sapevo
stile,
già,
perché
me l'avevano
penso
già detto.
A un corto in CGI o a un corto in 2D c'è un approccio molto diverso su alcuni aspetti tecnici, così come c'è un apporto diverso da un film in 2D a un film in stop motion. Qui si parla di due generi e due mondi molto diversi. Come fa un creativo, e qui forse mi può rispondere meglio lui, ad adattarsi a un cambio di rotta di questo tipo?
Well, most of our team actually came from 3D, right? Like I, for example, worked at Blizzard in the cinematics department, and a lot of our artists
questa non la sapevo.
Came from making 3D games, because obviously 2D games are not as popular these days as they used to be in the past. So for us, we were always a little bit frustrated with, like people equating 2D games to, oh, that's a cheaper indie production, right? Because a lot of the stuff that we did with Ori was actually really hard to do, right? Because these engines these days, if you work in 3D, they do a lot for you. With 2D, that's not the case. So for Ori, we had to handcraft literally everything. We had to even write our own compression algorithms, right? Because the compression stuff that you do for 3D, in 2D you can do more efficient things if you just write it yourself, if you don't just trust the engine. So for us, it's not really been that much of a difference. The important bit is that we always get across that we want our games to feel like paintings come to life, right? Because we do not believe in this whole factory approach, right? Like if I look at a lot of games that are out there these days, they all look very similar. If I would take a screenshot right now of Diablo 4 and of Path of Exile 2 and show that to a normal person, right? Like just a person on the street out there, I don't think they would be able to tell the difference, right? And we don't want that, right? I want you to even see a single little screenshot or a thumbnail of one of our games and be able to say, yeah, that's Ori, right? Or yeah, that's No Rest for the Wicked, I think that is really, really important
può pure succedere. Per quest'altro non lo so.
To be seen in our
Bisognerà
games,
vedere.
Right? When Matteo paints an asset, right? I want to be able to look
Omega
at that
Weapon,
and say,
grazie mille.
that was beautifully
Grazie mille
handcrafted
della
by
sub.
Matteo,
Anniversario,
right? And not just,
esatto. Grazie,
this was taken from some model library or that kind of thing, right? No, with Moon Studios, it's all about creativity. We have some of the best keyframe animators in the world in our team. We have some of the best concept artists in the world in our team. And I think that's really important, that people generally at Moon are really proud of their work. Yeah, exactly. That people are really proud of the work, and that even as a gamer, right, that you see that, right?
Decisamente si vede.
Because look at Ori, right? Ori is this 2D game, and still, even when we released Ori and the Blind Forest on Switch, which came like 5 years after the initial release, right? People still mentioned, wow, this is one of the most beautiful games out there. And that is something that we take pride in, that we don't just do good-looking stuff because of tech, right? Because, oh, it's another Unreal 5 engine thing, but because of our art direction.
Infatti ho fatto questa domanda perché guardando Ori e guardando questo nuovo trailer durante i VGA, nonostante si vede, è ovvio che siano giochi diversi, immediatamente si riconosce la style.
Ci sono anche secondo me, per quanto un gioco possa essere diverso in stile, poi può essere il gioco più bello del mondo, però proprio visivamente sono tutti omogenei
questa impronta,
proprio perché, ma c'è un motivo per fare un gioco come lo facciamo a Moon, la produzione che ha, per quanto il team è piccolo, però è molto artigianale, cioè non riusciamo e non possiamo, proprio per il tipo di gioco e per come viene montato, prendere delle cose già fatte. Invece nel mondo, insomma, delle produzioni AAA, proprio perché il gioco è vastissimo, sono sempre più grossi i giochi, serve sempre più gente e bisogna in un qualche modo trovare delle escamotage. Gli escamotage sono scansioni 3D, texture pack già fatti, asset che comunque vengono fatti a produzione tipo da aziende cinesi, eccetera.
Appena di montaggio.
È vero. Invece non si può fare una cosa del genere a Moon.
I understood that.
Ok.
Quindi anche Thomas è d'accordo che il futuro del videogioco sarà nel ritornare un po' indietro, cioè nell'indie o il semi-indie, comunque tornare all'artigianalità.
I think we're already seeing some of that, right? So generally, I mean, you have these big productions. It's very similar, I think, to the movie industry, right? Where you have films that are basically, you know, your superhero films or something, things that are like, oh, this costs $250 million to make. But a lot of times the really interesting things are being done in the indie space. So I think that's just going to keep going that way, right? Where you have
Potrei
the
essere
typical
più
Call of
d'accordo.
Duties and all of that coming from really big productions. But I think a lot of the really creative and innovative stuff, yeah, is definitely being done.
Questo non vuol dire, faccio un attimino una pausa, questo non vuol dire che anche nel mondo delle grandissime produzioni non possono esserci dei prodotti che ti fanno dire porca miseria, veramente questo c'ha un grande valore. Tipo, in questo periodo sto rigiocando, dato che è uscita la remastered, no, The Last of Us parte 2, quello è uno di quei giochi che è molto, diciamo, mainstream e che però ha, secondo me, una cura e un valore veramente grandi, nel senso veramente importanti. Ed è una di quelle cose che, onestamente, non necessariamente devi dividere il mercato in settori, cioè tipo in classi. Possono esserci delle bellissime cose anche nel mondo AAA, o fatti da grandi produzioni o fatti da studi più indipendenti, team molto più piccoli e team anche più grandi. Lo stesso God of War anche è piuttosto ispirato. Guerriglia con Horizon fa delle bellissime cose. Però sì, ovviamente se invece prendi Call of Duty o purtroppo molte produzioni Ubisoft, ecco, lì si sente un po' la catena di montaggio, lì si sente la grandezza ma la poca sostanza, secondo me.
Done in the indie space.
So I wanted to ask you a question about the structure of your team, because Moon Studios always had a peculiar structure, so being a company working remotely even before the pandemic. So what are the pros and the drawbacks of the structures?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because we were the first studio probably in the world, the first game studio that worked this way, right? Where every single time when we released Ori and the Blind Forest and Will of the Wisp and so on, when we did interviews and so on, right? People always asked, how is this possible, right? That you are working with everybody distributed around the world and different time zones and so on, right? And to us, it was always natural, right? When we started Moon, my co-founder, Gennady Korol, was from Israel, right? We didn't have a lot of money. I came from Blizzard, right? I saved a bunch of money. And then it was just this whole, let's make some indie games. Let's see what happens, right? So it didn't make sense to have an office and to relocate, right? Our next person was from the UK, and then we hired from Australia. And then it just grew from there. So it happened quite naturally. And we just adapted to that. You know, we just basically, a lot of times we do meetings, right? When we do meetings, we record them. If somebody can't be there during that time because of whatever, like they have family stuff to do or something, you don't have to be there, but you have to catch up with the meeting. And it was funny, kind of like when COVID happened, right? All these big studios suddenly reached out to us and were like, oh my God, how do you guys do this? Because we have no idea, right? And we try to give them as best, like, advice as we could. But to us, this whole thing is really natural. Frankly, I have yet to see the downsides of it, right? Because the reason why we do it and why we stick to this is because it allows us to work with the best people in the world. Meaning, if I need an animator, I don't have to find a really good animator in Austria or in Europe, right? When, well, they all move to the West Coast to work at Disney, at Pixar, at Blue Sky, etc., right? So it allows us to do that, right? We have a lot of Russian artists that are amazing, right? I can hire people like Matteo and don't have to tell him, oh, you have to move your family and everything else to Vienna just to be able to do the work, right? I don't want to lose out on artists. And actually, I saw this at Blizzard as well, right? Like at Blizzard, back then when I worked there, Blizzard was like the holy grail of development studios, right? And I thought, oh my God, everybody who would reach out to would immediately accept an offer, right? But a lot of times that was not the case. A lot of times it was, sorry, my kids are in school. I don't want to lose talent because of that.
Regarding Ori, looking back at those two games, is there any peculiar lesson that you think you learned, both on a personal level and as a team as a whole throughout the development?
Yes, unbelievable amounts of lessons I learned. But I think what it really did is it just made us understand what our strengths are and the things that we're not so good at, right? Just generally at the studio, right? Like I want to always play to the strengths of the studio. So we're doing the kind of things that make sense for our team that don't necessarily make sense for other teams, right? But we want to just explore what this team can do.
So I know you have a tight schedule, but I wanted to ask a few more questions. Just I'm curious to know who owns the Ori IP, you or Microsoft, if you can say that. Just speculating, would it be possible for you to make a sequel in the future without their approval?
No. Back then, in order to get Ori
Porca
funded,
miseria,
we had to give up our
questa
IP,
è una...
which I'm a little bit sad about, right? Because Ori now became my Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. I would not want to probably not make another Ori game unless we get that IP back, right? These kind of deals where the actual creators lose out on their IP aren't really being done anymore these days. So if we make another Ori, I would want to approach Microsoft and ask them about, hey, can we buy the IP back? I think that would be a requirement for us.
And I guess that you would be like immensely sorry.
Questa è una cosa che non pensavo
I think
inizialmente.
they can have a try at it, but it's incredibly difficult.
Questa non la pensavo proprio per quello che ha detto lui, nel senso che è raro in realtà che gli studi vendano completamente la proprietà dell'IP senza possibilità di niente. Cioè, che uno studio che ha prodotto un IP e che non fosse parte, cioè, nel senso, uno studio che ha prodotto un IP ma che fosse stato acquisito, allora sì, ovviamente l'IP è proprietà del publisher, perché è lui che ti dà i soldi, banalmente, no? Però con Microsoft all'epoca non era così, cioè Moon Studios non ha mai fatto parte di Microsoft, ma Microsoft ha messo i soldi per lo sviluppo ed è stato il publisher. Ecco, e questo è un qualcosa di strano, e quando se ne è parlato io davo per scontato che loro avessero ancora la proprietà dell'IP, e invece no. Brutta cosa questa qua. Brutta cosa. Il che vuol dire che probabilmente non vedremo mai un nuovo Ori, tra la serie possibilità, il che mi rattrista tremendamente. Qualche rumor, mi sembra di ricordarlo anch'io, cioè, a meno che non arrivi un altro studio a realizzarlo, ma
to make it. So, let me ask you guys a question. Do you know any studio that you think could do another Ori?
No.
No, I don't think so.
The same way that you structured the original one, also in terms of technology, it would be like very, very hard to think about a substitute.
Even in terms of the art style and so on, right? There aren't that many studios out there that do 2D games anymore, and then to be able to produce it at that level, I think that would be very difficult to find. So I don't want to disappoint fans and tell them there's never going to be an Ori 3, right? I think it's just going to be really, really difficult for Microsoft to find a studio out there in the entire world.
Questo pezzo questo pezzo di Ori qua in particolare è probabilmente una delle cose più belle che abbia mai visto nel mondo dei videogiochi.
Right? I think that's difficult.
I could name you one that would not be on par.
Perché comprare un IP se non la usi? Ma perché all'epoca la usavano, e come? È uscito il primo Ori e poi ne è uscito un altro.
No, it's really hard.
It's hard, yeah. Or like going in a completely different way, Studio MDHR.
Yeah, but they would turn it into something really different, which, by the way, I would love to see that. That would be amazing,
Ti volevo chiedere, dato che sono state fatte centinaia di mascotte videoludiche, soprattutto negli anni 90, quando c'è stato il
Microsoft
boom
faccia come Nintendo con Game Freak,
16 bit, come siete arrivati al design di Ori? Avete avuto delle ispirazioni? Siete andati verso una possibilità ben precisa fin dall'inizio, oppure doveva essere un altro animale? Avete fatto una crasi tra varie mascotte che magari appartenevano alla vostra infanzia, adolescenza?
Actually, it was a much different approach. I was mainly inspired by Princess Mononoke, by Studio Ghibli. And, I watched that. I can actually tell you when, right? Like, I watched Princess Mononoke on the 23rd of December in 2009. We first wanted to make another game called Warsup. You can actually watch that on YouTube still. But then it became very clear that we should focus on a smaller title first. And I watched
L'albero Ginso, esattamente quello.
And I thought,
ricordo distintamente, sono rimasto a bocca aperta con la pelle d'oca. Esattamente la stessa cosa.
I always loved these little Kodama figures that they had in there. So that was the main inspiration. And then we just started sketching something, right? And, we had 100 design sketches of what Ori should become. And we picked that one because it was cute.
What's the name of the first game you were working on? Sorry.
It was called War Soup. Yeah, it came from Blizzard. We wanted to do a mix between Halo and StarCraft, like basically a first-person shooter that has some real-time strategy stuff where you actually play a 1v1 or 2v2, but you'd actually have to upgrade your character while you were playing a match.
Going back to No Rest for the Wicked, I would love to know how deep will be the lore of that word.
They actually pitched No Rest for the Wicked to publishers before we pitched Ori and the Will of the Wisps. So back in 2016. And then we did Will of the Wisps. That gave us about a 3-year, 4-year window before we would really fully go into production on No Rest for the Wicked. No Rest for the Wicked was only thrown into production in early 2018, right? So it gave us quite a bit of time. And then Will of the Wisps shipped 2020. That's when everybody moved on Will of the Wisps. So it gave us quite a bit of time to actually write the book beforehand, right? So I always kind of like had a little group, like 4 or 5 people or so on No Rest for the Wicked. And it gave me the time to actually write the story. Matteo will probably tell you as well, right? That there is much more lore. Like it's very similar to Star Wars, right? Where George Lucas wrote a huge thing and then had to split it up into multiple episodes, right? That's sort of what happened to us as well, that we wrote something that is really huge. And then it became very clear we cannot produce this much, right? So we actually, what you will see in the game is not even Act 1, right? So we have a lot to come in the future after that.
Oh, quindi è in realtà una cosa che non finisce là per niente, ok? No Rest for the Wicked è solo l'inizio.
For sure, like the action element improved a lot to the point that I loved, you know, the fights in there, and I wish there was like a palace, kind of like DMC style, just, you know, for the sake of combat itself. In here, combat seems obviously going towards a different route, but at the same time, it's clearly very important in the gameplay. Can you tell us a bit more about how it plays? Like, what were the ideas behind the definition of the combat system?
Let me give you a bit of background, right? So I actually played all the Diablo games, you know, like Diablo 2 and so on. I played Diablo 1 first, right? Thought, hey, that is pretty great. Then they made Diablo 2 and I was like, wow, imagine, you know, this is already really great. Imagine the ARPGs we'd be playing 10, 15 years down the road, right? And I had a lot of ideas for like where the genre could be heading even back then. And then that idea, like that never really came true, right? Like Diablo 3 came out and was like, this is kind of like a
tipo 3 giochi, qualcosa del genere.
Streamlined. And there are a lot of things about the ARPG genre where I thought, man, we could really have a huge influence there. Because if you look at the ARPG, top-down ARPG games, right? You look at Diablo, you look at Lost Ark, you look at Path of Exile and so on. They're all very much copy from the original Diablo formula, right? Like, look at the combat, right? It's all the point and click combat, where you just click, 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 right? To us, we thought, man, we could make this a lot better and modernize it all, right? And so we immediately said, hey, we want to do an animation commit combat system, which means every single weapon that we have in the game has to have its own animation, its own moveset, basically, all unique animations, right? So that in combat, it's really important. What is the weight of your weapon? What's the distance, right? What's the speed of it? What's the pacing between you and the enemy and so on? So that there's this really beautiful dance that forms during the combat. That doesn't mean that every enemy is like super difficult to fight, right? But we wanted it to be tactile and really satisfying, right? So that when you actually kill an enemy with your heavy weapon, right, you could actually split that enemy apart and so on, right? Like to just make it super satisfying. And
questo mi piace.
To us, combat in No Rest for the Wicked is obviously as important as platforming in Ori, right? Like for Ori, it was super important that just moving around the world, even if I just have a little debug test level, right? That just feels satisfying and feels really...
Questo è, ragazzi, incredibilmente importante e voglio fare un parallelo. Questa me l'ha detta Luca Wright, in realtà. Gli sviluppatori di Celeste hanno passato, se non ricordo male, tipo un mese, proprio in un livello un po' vuoto, no? A fare nient'altro che valutare il feeling che si aveva pad alla mano con il personaggio che si muoveva. Letteralmente nient'altro che andare in giro, saltare da una parte all'altra, e fino a quando non hanno trovato il modo di rendere il solo movimento del personaggio preciso, soddisfacente e coinvolgente, non si sono mossi. Questo mi fa ecco, e Moon Studios ha fatto sicuramente la stessa cosa, se non ancora meglio, perché Ori è un assoluto capolavoro da questo punto di vista. Il game feel di Ori, la precisione che ha e il feeling del muoversi, del colpire, delle varie cose è tra i migliori che ci sia in assoluto tuttora. Ok? E quindi, nonostante sappiate bene che non sono un fan del combattimento alla Souls, se mi dicono che con il combattimento hanno avuto lo stesso approccio, questo mi fa molto ben pensare. Perché se uno studio che ha avuto la capacità di fare questa cosa qualitativamente a un livello eccelso in Ori sta utilizzando lo stesso approccio con quest'altro, ma sul combattimento, cioè il platforming di Ori, incredibile, sarà curato, avranno la stessa cura nel combattimento di questo nuovo titolo, allora ok, nel senso mi sa tanto che nonostante tutto potrebbero realizzare qualcosa di veramente molto 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 figo. Meglio Celeste e Hollow Knight, allora, sono due giochi incredibili tutti e due. Hollow Knight è molto più ricco, Celeste è molto più diciamo arcade vecchio stile. In Celeste devi fare una cosa, è un platforming puro, di fatto ci sono livelli molto difficili, è fatto benissimo il titolo e c'è una storia, cioè Hollow Knight ha tante cose, è un Metroidvania bello complesso con un approccio un po' Souls al combattimento e al design.
Good, right? For no rest for the wicked, that is combat, right? Like I need to make sure that if I just throw you into a little test level and that just spawn enemies at you, that you would want to play this for hours.
Oh,
right?
che
and
figata
so
questa!
We really focused
Questa
on just making that
informazione è
as
una
juicy as
figata.
possible and as satisfying as possible. And then hopefully we are also innovating on top of what's out there, right? With a lot of games that are out there, let's take the Dark Souls series. There's still this thing where you can only do either combo attacks or specials. And we wanted to head more into the fighting game direction, right? Where in Street Fighter, I can do, light punch, fierce kick, Hadouken, right? Those kind of things. So we wanted to do that as well. That you could, that you don't just either choose like between the combo attacks or every now and then you can do an R2 special, right? We wanted all of that to be really fluent. And then obviously like our keyframe animation department is unbelievable. So we wanted that to look amazing, like a Jackie Chan thing, right?
Quindi è pure piuttosto profondo il
like we have all
combattimento.
these animation principles in there, squash and stretch, follow through, right? So it just has to be a joy to look at and also a joy to play.
Man, let me play this.
Madonna, ecco.
Do you have a build?
Ecco, sì, ho pensato la stessa identica
you
cosa.
mentioned it, and also in the trailer it's pretty clear this game is gonna
Picchiaduro li gioco, però cioè, non è che sono un grande fan.
Was
Il mio preferito è Tekken e sta per uscire, non vedo l'ora.
Something that happened throughout the development because of the animation and because you wanted the combat system to feel more like relevant and heavy.
So it's interesting, right? Because with Ori and the Blind Forest, a lot of times we got the critique almost, right? That it's like, it looks like a children's game, but it's actually really hard. And then it also tells a story that is actually quite heavy a lot of times, right? Like you have characters dying, all the time. For Ori, we always, in terms of storytelling and so on, we used allegory, right? We had these fantastical creatures, but then we still told a very human story, right? Like at the start of Ori and the Blind Forest, you literally have an orphan seeing how his mother dies in front of him. And so I always like to dabble with these really heavy subjects, right? And with story themes that are universal to all of us, that we all can connect with, right? With Ori, for example, the prologue worked so well because the death of a parent is something that we all, to some degree, either went through or can at least emphasize with, right? For No Rest for the Wicked, when I wrote the initial story draft, I wanted to also do that, right? Like basically write this Shakespearean tale where it's all very much almost melodramatic, right? Where it's very much, this speaks to themes that we all have to go through, right? It's family and how politics can fuck up families. How when you put into really difficult situations, right? How does this or that person handle that? And so we didn't want to shy away this time from really telling a mature story that has these human themes that everybody can connect with, right? But then also not shy away from the violence and brutality, right? And it's a huge difference to Ori, right? Where it was very whimsical. Yeah, it was important to us that we would not shy away from, all these subjects and would be able to show the violence and the brutality. If some quest happens and somebody has to die because of some action you take, right, you want the player to feel what decision you made, right? And a lot of times that has to be shown for it to have that effect.
Did the success of Game of Thrones played any part in this?
Well, I was a huge Game of Thrones fan, so obviously, yes, I took some inspiration from that, right? I also have all the Song of Ice and Fire books and so on, right? Yes, we took a lot of inspiration from these things, right? In a lot of ways, No Rest for the Wicked, we hope that it becomes to us like that, something like a Lord of the Rings or a Game of Thrones or something, right? Like this epic fantasy saga that we can tell over a long period of time. And then hopefully, many years down the road, when you guys see the end, right, that it will all be like, yeah, that was worth it. That was amazing.
Thomas.
Madonna.
Hour, so I think
Ok.
Don't indulge too much.
Release you now. Thank you. Thanks a lot. This is very unusual to have such a great interview a few days after the release. So thanks
Thank
a
you
lot.
very much.
Thank you very
Thomas.
much. And
grazie anche a
good
Matteo
luck.
che ci ha permesso tutto questo, ovviamente.
Grazie. And good luck.
We're coming to
the rest
Austria.
for the
I
week.
want to play again.
I have my studio here. If you guys come over, let's go for some coffee.
Let's do it.
Esatto.
Ok, parto.
Grazie mille. Thank you
much.
Allora,
Bye.
Foss aveva quello sguardo del ok, quant'è adesso? Fammi vedere su Google Maps quanto ci vuole arrivare in Austria. Parto adesso, Sì. Oh ragazzi, ok. Allora vi dico la verità, quando è stato annunciato il nuovo gioco di Moon Studios, ovviamente sono impazzito perché da grandissimo fan di Ori ero contentissimo di vedere una nuova produzione dello studio, ok? Quando però qualcuno mi ha detto in realtà il combattimento sarà alla Souls, mi sono calate le palle proprio, se sono al 12° piano mi sono calate più o meno al piano terra, no? Ecco, questo è perché sapete che non sono un fan del combattimento alla Souls, però adesso sentire che quello che vi stavo dicendo prima, hanno messo una tale cura sul game feel, sulla volontà di intrattenere una persona e far venire voglia di combattere per ore e ore e ore, mi fa capire che forse ci sarà un approccio che magari è stato ispirato dal combattimento stile Dark Souls, ma che va in una direzione della pura gioia dell'arcade, cioè della pura gioia l'ha detto proprio lui, vogliamo realizzare un qualcosa che se anche ti dovessimo piazzare un personaggio all'interno di una stanza vuota e ti dovessimo spammare nemici a caso, tu vorresti giocarci per ore. Ecco, questa è una cosa che veramente mi piace molto e mi fa pensare che le cose potrebbero andare bene, senza parlare del fatto che il team ovviamente ha dimostrato di saper fare le cose con una qualità eccelsa, senza parlare del fatto che a quanto pare No Rest for the Wicked non è il primo progetto post Microsoft, quindi vi offriamo qualcosa di diverso. No, adesso ho capito che cosa intendevano quando dicevano questo sarà il nostro prossimo Zelda. Hanno grandi ambizioni per questo gioco, che non sarà soltanto un gioco ma un vero e proprio franchise, se ho ben capito. E questo è una cosa molto interessante, e non vedo l'ora, maledizione, non vedo l'ora. Ok, nel corso del 2024 probabilmente avremo più informazioni su questo titolo, lo vedremo più volte e sant'Iddio ovviamente ne parleremo, ovviamente vedremo, perché sì, è probabilmente uno dei titoli che aspetto di più in assoluto, c'è poco da fare, sì.